How you doing, guys? This is Ben from Rawcritics, back with another Star Citizen discussion video. I originally had planned on kind of creating a series revolving around individual careers and potential ways people could differentiate themselves, differentiate themselves from the pack within each of those careers. But I still plan on doing that series. However, the more I kind of learned about the career paths and the economy, so to speak, I felt like I first needed to kind of take a step back and look at the main engine driving this thing, and the engine, of course, being the Star Citizen economy. Technically, this is a spin-off of the concepts I started to introduce in my older Star Wars Galaxy Star Citizen video. You can actually, if you haven't seen it, check it out here. However, since then, I've kind of had a chance to familiarize myself with the current economic plan as I think it stands now, kind of the base model that was laid out around July 2013, plus additional information that I've picked up in the forums and Reddit and various citizen created videos. But please let me know if I'm missing any major updates to the economic plan as I kind of lay it out here. On that note, I have two goals for this video. The first is to kind of quickly overview what I believe to be the foundational planned elements for the Star Citizen economy for the benefit of any newcomers, and in addition, if there's anything I have wrong or I've misinterpreted anything or anything is kind of out of date, you veterans can kind of call me out. The second reason is to propose an additional layer of depth for your critique that could theoretically open the doors for players to have the ability to kind of really differentiate themselves in the Star Citizen universe. Beyond being a pirate or being a tuner with some real-time skill. Ultimately, in the end, I want to be able to ask the question, how deep does the Star Citizen community want their economic-related experiences to be? So with that, I think everyone's familiar with the original 2-minute economic video that Chris laid out, again, back in, I believe that was released in July 2013. He laid out kind of a general plan where players, and he described the economic system as players being able to affect the supply and demand dynamic, as he labeled it, and that whole system is kind of based around this node system, and the nodes themselves are things like training nodes and population nodes that kind of focus on producing, I should say, workers and military types. Nodes can also be stuff like refining nodes and manufacturing nodes, which produce materials for production, and also the parts that make up final products themselves. So real quick, we're going to take a look at the various nodes, what goes into the nodes, and then what comes out as a export. Real quick, just in case anyone needs a refresher, any newbies are watching this video for the first time, trying to figure out how the Star Citizen economy is going to work. Population nodes, as I mentioned, and training nodes. Population nodes produce workers, training nodes produce pilots, marines, and soldiers. For the population nodes, the intake is like food, water, construction materials, medical supplies. Again, this is all kind of very first pass stuff. So again, a lot of this stuff could have changed or will probably change as they develop the economic system. But I'm just laying a foundation for the second half of this video in terms of possible expansion. So I just kind of want to lay a framework here. Training nodes, they take those workers and materials and they produce pilots, marines, and soldiers. There are entertainment nodes, repair nodes, raw material nodes. Obviously, entertainment boosts morale within like a supply chain. Repair nodes obviously gets a ship into flight readiness mode. Obviously, that takes in like workers, machinery, money, fuel, stuff like that. Raw material nodes and refining nodes, those both, just by the name of it, you can tell that they handle the resources. You get raw resources out of them and refined resources out of them, respectively. Manufacturing nodes, advanced manufacturing nodes, component manufacturing nodes, and assembly line nodes. Those kind of handle the various stages of part development through final like weapons, missiles, and like ship development. And then lastly, the initial proposition had these other three nodes: reseller nodes, transport nodes, and communication nodes. All three of these are bi-directional nodes, which means they take in money, goods, and resources, and money, goods, and resources can go out the other way, either way. Communication nodes, obviously, instead of that, it's bidirectional flow of information through those nodes. So these nodes are going to be all around the universe, and a supply chain, when we talk about a supply chain, it's basically linking these nodes, so to speak, meaning like, for example, the population nodes, the workers from the population nodes would be fed into a training node for kind of producing pilots, Marines, and soldiers. So the process of producing workers, and then somebody transports them, or maybe it's an AI that transports them into a training node. That is like a very simple example of a supply chain, right? So let me stress again that we don't have all the information. This is obviously, as a result, going to be subject to change or expand. But the question I'm posing to you guys, and this kind of gets into the second phase of this video, is, does this system take it far enough for you guys? So in the name of exploring kind of this second part of this video, and again, before is, since we don't have all the information, let's just assume for a second that at the end of the day, the output for all these nodes is the same, no matter what you do, right? So for example, a refined resource is always going to be the same quality. As an object coming out of that node, a refined resource is always going to be the same quality. A worker, for example, coming out of a population node is always going to be the same type of worker, meaning it has the same efficiency, and they might break it down. There might be different kinds of workers in the end, but a particular worker, or in this case, just a worker, has the same type of efficiency coming out of that population node. And actually, in the example that they show, a missile coming out of an assembly line node always has the same kind of internal stats. There are variables in place that kind of affect these objects, these output objects, after the fact. But for this conversation, we're just talking about it as the object itself. For instance, a missile that's used in kind of various launchers could perform differently, right? Or physics-based forces could adjust the trajectory of that missile. So those are the external forces. What I'm talking about is the actual object themselves. In this case, it's a missile. So now that we have that clarification, currently it looks like the only variable on a node's output is the number of units produced. So there's different factors, and here's the actual formula that they use. It's essentially the number of units produced is the only end variable of this thing. So now for the kind of brainstorming portion of the video. As I mentioned before, my question to you guys, does this system take it far enough? So let's look at just for an example, so I can break this out, let's look at the factory example from Chris's economy video. There are 3 static inputs or elements, or objects, I should say, that go into this assembly line node. In this case, it's metal alloys, electronics, and explosives, I believe. So, and those get processed, and then the output in this example is a missile. What I want to explore here is kind of what would happen if we were to, say, add variable stat inputs or attributes to these objects, the metal, the explosives, the electronics, and as a direct result, the outputs became varied as well. And keep in mind, as we go forward with this example, the goal here is to ultimately kind of set up, or explore, I should say, setting up the economic system for additional emerging gameplay breakthroughs on the non-combatant side of the Star Citizen universe. As an example, higher quality, maybe if the electronics had kind of variable qualities or attributes, higher quality electronics could give a missile a higher accuracy, or perhaps even a longer distance on the output missile, so to speak. Or alternatively, perhaps a higher explosive quality or attribute could maybe drive up the damage a little bit on the output missile. Visually, I was kind of thinking how this could work, and from what I'm thinking, it could be represented in one of 2 ways. The first way is to add attributes to an object. For instance, metal alloy could have a durability attribute that ranges from 1 to 10. Explosives could have a potency, like a power or potency attribute that ranges from 1 to 10. Or the electronics themselves could have like a throughput attribute, or maybe even a conductivity attribute that also ranges from 1 to 10. So I can kind of hear the comments now, and CGI has kind of consistently said that balance is key for them, right? So there needs to be drawbacks to any advantage, right? So as such, you can kind of maybe even introduce a second attribute to kind of add a layer of dimension to handle these drawbacks. So if we take the former example, metal alloys could maybe have like a overall durability in addition to like maybe a kinetic resistance or a shock resistance that could be maybe like 8 and 2 respectively, just to balance it out. Like it could be like strong in kinetic resistance and weaker in shock resistance, or vice versa. There maybe even could be maybe really rare metal alloys that kind of have higher of both, not like max 10-10 stat on each, but like a 6 and a 7 if you need that kind of like higher dual use resistance. But more than likely, in most cases, like metal alloys would be like one or the other, just to add some kind of variation there. So strengths and weaknesses. If you want something that's more resistance to kinetic stuff, you obviously use those kind of metal alloys. If you want something that's more resistance to like physical, like shock, you'd use that. Explosives could have, as I mentioned before, a potency attribute and maybe a blast radius attribute, right? That ranges from 1 to 10. But again, you couldn't have both at 10, right? So you could have like a high blast radius, or I should say a high blast radius and a low potency, or vice versa. You could have a high potency and a low blast radius. Again, maybe there's some rare stuff where you can get like 5 or 6s and 7s on each of them, but again, those are rare exceptions. And electronics actually could maybe theoretically have like a throughput attribute that kind of increases the distance the missile can travel. And we're not talking a lot here. We're just talking like maybe 100 meters or something like that. Anyway, so throughput attribute that increases the distance a missile can travel, while maybe a conductivity attribute that kind of favors a little bit higher accuracy in targeting. But again, you will have to sacrifice in most cases one for the other. So what would this all lead to? It would all lead to an output, a product or an output of that node. In this example, which is a missile with maybe potential stats, something like an accuracy of 8 and damage 3 and a radius of 6, or maybe a flip of that, depending on other resources you use. It has like an accuracy of 3, damage of 9, and like a radius of 4. So that's the first way I can think of visually representing these attributes or variables. If all these numbers are kind of scary for you, then maybe CIG could keep things a little bit simpler, right? And maybe reduce the number ranges, or hide the numbers behind some different naming conventions. For example, there could be an input labeled like max impact explosives, and that would represent a blast radius, attribute of 1 and like a damage attribute of 5 out of 5. And the inverse of that, there could be full spread explosives as opposed to max impact explosives. The full spread explosives would maybe represent a blast radius attribute of 5, again out of 5, and a damage attribute of 1. And lastly is maybe like a in between that kind of represents a first step before the full spread explosives. You could have maybe like an increased spread explosive, right? And that would represent a blast radius, maybe give or take around like a 3.5 out of 5, and a damage attribute of maybe 1.5752, something like that. And on the other side of the node, the output of this simpler attribute form would be something like high precision missile X, right? And which has an accuracy of 5, a damage of 2, and a radius of 3. Again, out of the 5 scale system. Or alternatively, a high damage missile X, which has like an accuracy of 2, a damage of 5, and like a radius of 1. So I would argue that the greater the number range, the more variations, which are the numbers that kind of traders, crafters, and those interested in the economy, like myself, can kind of sink their teeth into, right? But even a more simplified system, like a 1 through 5, or maybe the simplified naming conventions in the latter example, even that would add exponential variations kind of on the node output. So it is worth noting that this example in the economy video is kind of a snapshot in the middle of the supply chain process. So just as the produced missile with variable attributes is the product of this assembly line node, if we were to kind of take a look at a step back in the process of the chain, let's say at the component manufacturing node level that make up the materials that go into that missile, maybe you would see something like this, just as to give you a bigger picture here. So like the input would maybe have like a fuse with a speed of 8 out of 10, refined explosive powder, which represents the charge, would be like a power of 3, or it could be a variation, but you'd have like a power of 3 out of 10. And then or X, whatever or for the actual container of the explosive. Durability has maybe like a durability of 5 and a resistance of 2. And those would be put into a component manufacturing node. And the output, of course, would be an explosive with, in this example, would maybe be like an explosive with a blast radius attribute of 5 out of 5 and a potency attribute of 1. Or if you want to kind of look at it in the simpler form, it could just be represented by the name full spread explosive. So instead of using just a standard static single type explosive in the assembly line node in Chris's example in the economy video, you'd be using in this example, you'd be using a full spread explosive, right? And that full spread attribute, where it has an attribute of blast radius of 5 and a potency of 1, that would ultimately affect, like I talked about before, that would ultimately affect the outcome of the missile in the next node, because that is the variable stats that are being fed into that node in the first place. So to kind of theorize maybe and take this whole thing, this whole process kind of a step further, because we're having fun, right? Nodes themselves could maybe even have efficiency ratings themselves that kind of affect the output. Like, for instance, an assembly line node may be more or less effective at delivering the output or delivering whatever's being made in there based on maybe internal or external forces. So, for example, we have a training node, right? So where the output is soldiers and pilots and so forth, and the input is workers. So the workers themselves aren't modified. Maybe they're an object, right? So that worker goes into that node, but that particular node is being affected by maybe, let's say, an insurrection or like a raid or something that they're kind of nervous about. But it's just that node that's being affected. Meaning, if those workers went to a different node, they wouldn't be affected. But since they're going to this node that has like a raid or a nearby pirates attacking something, maybe their efficiency is a little bit lower, so the output isn't as high of a quality. So maybe there could be something that kind of affects nodes on that level as well. So the thought behind all of this is kind of is that the varied qualities on the input and output objects, right? It opens the door. I think it opens the door, as I mentioned before, towards emerging gameplay. And to give you some examples of what could potentially happen, you could theorize that consumers themselves who don't need super high-end missiles for like a particular mission, there's something, maybe a low-tier mission or whatever, they could theoretically save on money and get some lower quality missiles that will do the job for now. So that whole kind of high-low or high-quality, low-quality thing comes into play, which is kind of cool. Instead of hiring and working with vendors that kind of only deal with one quality or high quality resources, this particular seller could maybe create a demand for lower quality or larger bulk, lower quality quantities of metals or electronics or what have you. And I think that would kind of fit nicely with the kind of aforementioned budget consumer, along with potentially newcomers that are not really able to haul in higher quality resources, or it's out of their price range for the time being. So they can still make progress. They can still participate in the economy and take these lower, cheaper resources and do something with them in the universe. They can haul them somewhere, so they can get their start as a hauler. For instance, day traders will probably pop up regardless anyway. But think about it. What would happen if there's many different qualities of each type of item, right? Day traders. I mean, there could be kind of a real day trading market theoretically. Another example, an organization maybe that's focusing on lower end quality missiles. Maybe they could hire pirates who kind of target materials, right? That are on their way to kind of higher quality or higher efficiency factories, right? So they can hire pirates to kind of take out the higher quality competition, and if the pirates are successful, they could theoretically drive up the prices on the higher quality missiles, which would then kind of create a lower quality missile need, or I should say an economic viability for those lower quality missiles. One last emergent kind of gameplay idea that I thought of. someone could specifically be known as, and I always kind of mention this before, there's like, this person is known for something, right? So someone could specifically known as like the go-to person for being able to provide a particular type of part. For instance, like a high blast radius explosive, right? And they're known for kind of maybe producing these high blast radius in like the attribute blast radius of 8, 9, and 10, or maybe 7, 8, 9, whatever. They would be known for delivering that kind of part, and maybe someone else, they don't have kind of the resources or the experience or the connections to consistently sell 8, 9, and 10 attribute blast radius attributes. So this guy would kind of differentiate himself, right? With time and supply and connections and whatnot, he's able to kind of produce a higher blast radius explosives. That doesn't mean that the lower guy with the lower quality stuff is cut out of the market. It's just he's going to cater to a different user that would use that type of stuff. On top of all that, you could place decays on all this stuff too. You know what I mean? So like things could eventually decay, creating a need for re-upping or rebuying and stuff like that. The only caveat to this whole thing, I would say, is the ships. Obviously, I wouldn't put attributes on ships or whatever. I would only put attributes on kind of consumables, right? So that means like even if you find like a super rare piece of alloy that ultimately ends up making a particular missile or a set of missiles higher quality, ultimately that's a consumable, so it'll be used up eventually. So there's no kind of like permanent god mode. No one could claim like permanent god mode. So a ship itself probably wouldn't be. They would be all standardized and the same. But it'd be this whole thing is kind of based around the idea that consumables could be modified to have various ranges, thus giving obviously short-term advantages to some people. But again, there's proposed advantages and disadvantages that kind of balance out the need, and again add kind of different dynamics. Do I want to go with the higher blast radius missiles, or do I want to go with the higher damage missiles? Choose your path. So all that aside, and this is kind of going into theorizing a bit more, CIG could even kind of maybe even consider introducing down the line player-generated nodes like refineries and manufacturing plants for kind of individual, or probably realistically more for organizations, right? Because at a cost, a sizable startup and maintenance cost, these organizations could kind of this could be like a long-term goal for organizations that would be maintaining your own nodes, buying and maintaining, or creating and maintaining your own nodes, or even broader than that, your own supply chains on your home base or home planet. It would be kind of cool to explore that concept. Again, there would have to be some sort of disadvantage, so maybe non-player created nodes aren't able to go as high of an efficiency. Maybe you would have to travel to one of the actual placed nodes by the developers. I don't know. Just throwing ideas out there. But the idea of a home planet, obviously, that could then, interestingly enough, and this doesn't really have anything to do with it, but that could play into the concept of organizations being able to have a home city or player cities. So again, that's stuff down the line, but that's stuff that would be really, really amazing. As for the larger supply chains themselves, meaning the collections, kind of a collection of nodes that work together, as I mentioned before, it would be interesting to kind of see where CGI goes with the concept of being able to take over a node within a supply chain and kind of allowing players to try and balance that entire supply chain themselves, right? Big payoffs if they're able to do it, but it would probably be hard or tedious, or take multiple players in coordination to kind of maintain that supply chain. Out of this, we could potentially see some really successful player-run supply chains that, for example, could, like before, it could maybe focus on producing high-damage missiles, right? Against a competitor that is producing kind of high blast radius missiles, the market would ultimately kind of dictate which of these are more valuable, but both would have a place in the economy and kind of allow individuals and organizations to really stand out and fill a particular role that maybe many other organizations or people may not fill. Also, interestingly enough, this allows for scenarios where kind of subterfuge and nonviolent takeovers could occur for control of a particular, or maybe like a popular supply chain or a node on a supply chain. And these would include like scenarios that wouldn't necessarily seem as appealing without the added level of object attributes that are applied to these input and output nodes, right? Otherwise, I think they would just the people that are planning the takeover wouldn't. It seems like they would just maybe find another generic missile node, right, and take that over or whatever. There'd be some advantage to working your way into something that's producing maybe a high blast missile, high blast radius missile, for instance. But even if that did happen, and there was kind of a takeover, it doesn't necessarily mean the new operators will run the supply chain smoothly. So it could end up kind of declining in quality anyway, and failing, etc. So there's consequences. There's definitely some consequences there. So thoughts. In the end, I guess it's just kind of a matter of the level of detail that I should say, ultimately, the developers want in the Star Citizen economy. The level of detail that they want it to have and what kind of players they wish to attract to the game. Does Star Citizen want to cater to kind of standard MMO space, first-person shooter crowds, among others? Or is there kind of a desire to broaden and appeal to the, I will say, largely homeless population that is kind of craving a game with a bit more depth on the economic side of things, that gives the user kind of additional ways to differentiate themselves as they supply in-game goods to the masses. So it's really a question of where does kind of Star Citizen want to be on that side of the gameplay. So as I mentioned, this is kind of just an introduction video to the new career differentiation series that I'm planning. Because the content of that upcoming series is based on what is potentially possible in the game, I kind of wanted to first get a sense of I guess everyone's expectations for the economy. Again, clarify and make sure I didn't miss anything. So I wanted to kind of do this economy video before I actually delve into the new career differentiation series. So I appreciate everyone's time, and I look forward to any feedback that you guys have on this video. As always, you guys have been really supportive on these Star Citizen videos, and the community has been flipping awesome. So I'm kind of anxious to hear what you guys think about this, or in general, or other ideas maybe you have for the economy. So throw them by me. Let's have a conversation about it. All right, guys, appreciate you listening. This is Ben from Rawcritics, and I think I will now retreat back into the depths of the internet.